Hi, I'm Ed Marsh. Welcome to this episode of Signals from the OP. Signals is designed to put new ideas and perspectives in front of busy industrial company executives, but in brief, easily digestible video chunks. If you follow the business news, you've heard a lot lately about ESG, or environmental, social, and governance guidelines for business. You likely get questions from some of your employees, and probably often questionnaires, surveys, and even edicts from stakeholders, customers, and vendors. So the question at hand is, how seriously should you take this trend? Will it impact your business strategically? The short answers, in my estimation, are not very and no, respectively. The longer answer, of course, is more nuanced and complex. Here's what I mean. Let's start with the origin of many of these initiatives. They tend to emanate from groups with good intentions, but no practical insight into their application, cost, or relative benefit. Now, we know obviously that some manufacturing businesses have acted shamefully at times in the past, as documented in periods of child labor, workplace injuries, polluted rivers, air, soil, and improper discriminatory labor practices. But no reasonable person seeks to return to those practices, nor inflict the consequences on themselves or their community, and to pretend otherwise is really absurd. Further, nearly every reasonable person will agree that reasonably reducing carbon emissions, reducing waste in landfills, increasing reuse and recycling are all reasonable goals to which we can each contribute. That's the innocuous way that ESG is promoted, but generally the intent, and therefore the impact, is much more insidious and often without regard for net cost or benefit, or what's called, when the shoe is on the other foot, disparate impact. So in theory, ESG is admirable, but in practice, it's a system of competitive barriers and a cynical play to consolidate monopolistic power. The primary advocates of ESG are cause-driven organizations that can't directly impact outcomes. The primary drivers of ESG are large investors. You've probably heard a lot about Larry Fink's BlackRock, State Street, and others who use financial leverage to dictate participation and compliance to companies. The companies in which they invest are naturally the large ones with substantial enough margins to commit resources to the pursuit of some of these lofty-sounding but impractical ideas. They, in turn, condition and encourage consumers to demand ESG affirmations without understanding the real impact on cost, availability, or even a multitude of cascading consequences. But it's a nice-sounding story. Some call it greenwashing. The companies that can afford to invest in these initiatives aren't the SMBs that provide most employment and produce most products. Rather, it's the enterprises whose management and owners see an opportunity to create market and regulatory barriers to competition which allow them to increase prices and market share. Now, you may think this sounds cynical, and perhaps you're correct, but it's also informed. Here's what I mean. The true measures of a company's ESG commitment and sincerity are first, the way it behaves when nobody important will see, and second, its candor in discussing the full complexity of the initiatives it supports. For instance, while GE talked about being a green energy company and invested millions in promoting that brand image, we now know that Jeff Immelt flew around the world with a backup private jet as a chase plane. While Starbucks promoted paper straws as a simple fix, it never discussed the additional number that a customer might require to make it all the way through one of those $7 drinks. It's also clear that for many companies, ESG is primarily a marketing tactic versus an ethos. One finds this in the dissonance between how they market in different countries, promoting ideologies in the US and EU, for instance, but willingly complying with explicit or cultural norms in others that are contradictory. And finally, simple-sounding ideas like cutting out single-use plastic don't consider food safety, entire product that's damaged and discarded, shelf life versus waste, nor do many reconcile the place they exert the impact with the actual sources of the problems. I've got a personal perspective on it as well. My work with manufacturers and capital equipment companies is based on my years of activity in the industrial manufacturing space. And in support of that, I run a small legacy business that sells and supports capital equipment. So in that context, I keep my fingers in the business to track what's going on in my clients' world. But that also means I'm able to track firsthand the way that many of these CPG companies that profess to be pure in intent actually work in practice. The unvarnished truth is that they abuse SMBs with usurious payment, operational, and contractual terms and practices. It's common for companies to suddenly stipulate 100-day payment terms, to require that vendors pay to subscribe to expensive proprietary order and invoice processing platforms, and even hire extra staff to manage the unique, complex, and unforgiving process that's different for each one, or even to agree to untenable cancellation and pricing terms just to get orders. Of course, there's an answer to this charge, and that's that vendors can refuse to comply, and that's true. But it's also true that there's essentially a de facto market control when BlackRock and their ilk can create blanket requirements for all companies across entire industries. They're creating a broad market condition which is anti-competitive and deleterious to small and medium-sized vendors that innovate and deliver value. Additionally, many in the F50, F100, 500, and F1000 are devious in delaying and avoiding payment, just as insurance companies are in paying claims. Many leverage the working capital of SMBs, carried at high cost to owners to retain earnings into operations as their own. In other words, with almost unfettered access to capital and debt markets and low-cost commercial credit, companies instead foist their burden onto small suppliers. So while they prance about and preen for the public and investors like BlackRock and advertise their ESG bona fides, in practice they abuse the very companies that in turn employ most of their customers. It's hypocritical, and it's performance theater. So here's my advice to middle market manufacturers. Don't get sucked into the game. Surveys show that most consumers support lofty sounding ideas, but make their choices based on practicalities. So approach these topics from a practical perspective. Honor your vision and values. Support the causes that are important to you because they reflect your and your company's vision. But don't get hung up on formal ESG programs as a lower or middle market machinery builder. And further, I'd suggest tactically pushing back on the myriad of demands you receive from buyers. I'm Ed Marsh. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Signals from the OP. If you enjoyed it, please share it and subscribe either to my YouTube channel, edmarshspeaks.tv, or at the related blog, signalsfromtheop.com.